Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the Circle Table, Forging a More Inclusive Research Ecosystem, a dialogue with key stakeholders. My name is Nick Ishmael Perkins, and I'll be your moderator for the next hour. As many of you are probably aware by now, the Falling Wall Circle Tables convene the world's brightest minds, and in our case, nicest people, from academia, business, and politics, to discuss how we can apply science, research, and innovation to get the world moving again. In this session, we're going to be focused on the vexing issue of inclusion and diversity. Over the past 2 decades, the scientific community has made commendable strides in advancing women in science, but gender, of course, is only one aspect of the inclusion agenda. The last few months have really surfaced for many of us how intractable and divisive the inequalities around race remain. And this panel will build on the conversation from yesterday's discussion, Combating Systemic Racism in Science, by today turning to the key institutions in the science research industrial complex, or ecosystem as we call it, for their response. Before we get into the substance of the discussion, just a couple of housekeeping issues. First, on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you will see the chat function, and we hope that you will be using it to engage the panelists as the panel proceeds. But don't limit your engagement just to questions. You can also respectfully share your thoughts on the proceedings as it progresses, because we appreciate in these trying times, we all like a bit of human interaction and the opportunity to express ourselves. Second housekeeping issue is the coffee. If you manage to taste any of the coffee in front of us, please let us know how you've managed that. We've all had to resort to bringing our own refreshments for the session, so you'll understand if there is no uniformity in the branding on our mugs. Now, let me take a moment to explain what you can expect over the next hour. We will start with a few comments from each of the panelists, and this will lead to some exchange around the circle table. And then, of course, I'm hoping to take questions from you, our audience. There's a lot that can be said and has been said on this issue. What the panel and I are going to try to do is to focus on the way forward. To help me with that, we have representatives from some of the most influential and ambitious organizations in the world of science research. Shirley Malcolm is the director of Sea Change. Daya Reddy is the president of the International Science Council. Dr. Karen Salt is deputy director of the Research Culture and Environment of the UK Research and Innovation. And Kumsal Bezak is the chief executive officer of Elsevier. So we're going to start by reflecting on 3 things. What, from the institutional perspective, is needed for greater racial inclusion in particular? What are your institutions doing about it? And what do you think would be the most useful focus for this discussion? What should we be aiming to get out of it to make sure that we can move forward? And I'm going to start with Shirley. In addition to her role at Sea Change, she is also a senior advisor at the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences. In these positions, along with her various trusteeships, she works to improve access to education and careers in STEM. In 2003, she received the Public Welfare Medal of the National Academy of Sciences, the highest award given by the Academy. And as you know, the AAAS annual conference is a fixture in any researcher's calendar, and they engage directly with the HQ of a global superpower. Shirley, you're sitting in Atlanta, really sitting in the moment right now. So in 5 minutes, let's hear, what are the issues and how are you and your institution leveraging your influence?
Thanks. I really appreciate the opportunity to join you. As I watched election returns earlier this week, I read a Science magazine article about Charles H. Turner, the prominent animal behavior researcher of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The authors reflected on Turner's work and surmised that he was a man ahead of his time, whose conceptual advances never really took root, but whose work is now being reconsidered in light of where the field of animal cognition is headed. Why didn't his work take hold? Why did the field have to rediscover things that Turner discovered and published decades before? The answers to these questions are complicated, but at their base is the fact that Turner was black. He could not gain access to the scientific ecosystem in ways needed to make his mark. Born 2 years after the end of slavery, Turner got much further than other black people did. A strong high school education, bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Cincinnati, a PhD in zoology from the University of Chicago, publication of his work, including in the pages of Science. But Turner never attained a position commensurate with his level of preparation. A position he thought he had disappeared when a black man showed up behind the highly lauded research. Meritocracy went out the window and racism came in the door. Turner had no graduate students to extend his work, no standing in his field to be able to get others to seriously consider his groundbreaking ideas. And while Turner suffered personally, the science suffered from not building on his ideas. The scientific ecosystem includes all of these pieces: colleges and universities, funders, publishers, peers, employers. At every turn, there are those who might ease one's path or guide your way or serve as gatekeepers and barriers to your progress. Unfortunately, science has a history of exclusion. Women and people of color have not had easy times finding space to enter, contribute, and advance. The challenges are systemic, so addressing them must be systemic. Because of the crucial gatekeeping and culture setting roles of colleges and universities, we at AAAS have sought to address that part of the system, adapting a model for doing that in the work of Athena Swan in the United Kingdom, taking that gender equality transformation system and advance HE's Race Equality Charter. We created Sea Change, STEM Equity Achievement Change, our uniquely American effort to support institutional transformation so that diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine become normative. The U.S. is not the only country burdened with racism in STEM or in society, but our legal structures constrain the options that are available for us to address it. So beginning in 2017, we set out on this journey to help support colleges and universities' transformation, borrowing from our colleagues in other parts of the world as they work towards similar goals. After the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others in May 2020, came America's protest and widespread calls for social justice, including in STEM, at a time of reckoning with systemic racism, a moment which led to reflection, a moment that felt all too familiar in other parts of the world. AAAS and science leadership moved boldly to respond. Editor-in-Chief Holden Thorpe on the editorial pages of the journal, CEO and science executive publisher Sudip Parikh, in his actions and calls for our own organizational accountability and assessment, our own internal sea change-like process to consider the ways that AAAS exercises its enabling functions. And that is what we are doing, looking at internal ways that AAAS exercises these functions. And that is our staffing, conference presenters, fellowship recipients and reviewers, authors and reviewers for the journal, the diversity within governance, the culture and climate of AAAS, and more. And we offer other societies an opportunity to join us in this journey, having recently received support from the Sloan Foundation to trial this process. As leader, publisher, convener, collaborator, gatekeeper, and enabler, as a professional society on this issue of racism in science, it is not just what we say, it is what we do to provide opportunities for all in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine to advance science and to serve society.
Thank you, Shirley. I think that was a really useful way to start the discussion. A really very compelling story of exclusion, as you say, through the history of science. And then you've mentioned actually three things that struck me immediately around your work around legal engagement, legal frameworks, the history of international exchange and solidarity, and also your own internal rigorous reflexivity around the cultural change. I'm going to turn to Daya now, who holds the South African Research Chair in Computational Mechanics at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. He is also a founder member of AIMS, the Africa Institute of Mathematical Sciences, and as president of the International Science Council, he engages with scientific organizations from 140 countries around the world and is involved in setting standards on science and policy globally. Daya, how are you leveraging that influence, and what do you see as the issues?
Thank you very much, Nick, and good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Yes, in fact, I'd like to address the question from the perspective of the ISC, which, as you've indicated, has members which are academies, science councils, and the like from over 140 countries, as well as more than 40 disciplinary scientific unions and associations that straddle the natural and social sciences, economics, and beyond. The mission of the ISC is to act as the global voice for science. Scientific freedom and responsible conduct in science are enshrined in the statutes of the ISC. It's part of our DNA, I would hope, our values, the objective of promoting equitable opportunities and, of course, opposing all forms of discrimination in science. Well, that's all very good, but we had the killing of George Floyd, and the reaction, the ripple, which grew into a kind of tsunami around the world, and which certainly caused us at the ISC to take a step back and to say, wait a minute, there are some things that we need to reflect on very seriously here. That is within the organization itself and within the science community as a whole. Shine a light on our practices. Ask questions about the nature of science, how science is practiced, how scientists engage or do not engage in science, methods of evaluation and the like. What sort of actions should we be taking beyond pious statements and simply reiterating what we have said over and over again? So the ISC convened, or invited, I would say, a number of organizations to come together with us with a view to exchanging information on this set of issues and to developing a framework for action, concerted action, to address discrimination and inequalities in science. I should say that the conversation started around race, but we agreed to extend it, that it be extended to include all forms of discrimination. We are now a group of 10, including AAAS, the Inter-Academy Partnership, the Global Young Academy, the World Federation of Engineering Organizations, and others. So where to from here? And again, now coming back to your question, I'd like to frame my perspectives around inequality and exclusivity. So the reality is that scientific communities, especially in the global south, are highly marginalized. There are huge disparities in access to knowledge, in the degree to which participation can take place. Lack of capacity, of real capacity in many parts of the world, discrimination on grounds of gender, race, and other forms as well. Weak science systems, complete marginalization from all the bits and pieces of the science ecosystem. Take research evaluation, for example, reviewing processes, collaboration. Where collaboration takes place, very often it is lopsided, where the Global South partner, scientific partner, or partner's role, is one to a large extent of providing the access to the field studies, the data and the like, rather than being a true partner in the collaboration. And we know all about the brain drain, of course. So there are a number of, if you like, ethical, moral reasons why we need to address all of this. But in addition, all of these factors serve to undermine what science is really all about and to weaken the science system as a whole. I'd like to just add another perspective to all of this from the direction of sustainability. Science and technology is a major lever, it's recognized as a major lever to accelerate transformations towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Science and technology, however, can only be successful if it is thoroughly integrated in all respects. We can only succeed in achieving the SDGs if we work together globally. There has to be participation across disciplines, transdisciplinary activity involving not only scientists but other communities as well is important. Full participation from the global south, young researchers, for example, real connectedness and real cooperation. In order to achieve those kinds of goals and for science and technology to be the lever which it is intended to be, we have to address all forms of discrimination and practices that are exclusionary and that serve to undermine these sorts of efforts. So that would be a further reason why we need to treat this issue with the degree of urgency which unfortunately we have not done in the past. So there's been the wake-up call and a concerted effort now that is underway. I will stop there. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Daya. I think a number of things that you've said there are really interesting. It's to me fascinating that you started a conversation that was that sounds quite conceptual in terms of the reflection on the nature of science, but also became very operational. And it's useful to hear your framing around the SDG agenda and the need to engage around transdisciplinarity if we're going to talk about racial inclusion. And I want to come back to that at some point in the conversation. But now I'm going to turn to Karen. Karen is an expert on sovereignty, power, collective activism, and systems of governance. With over 26 years experience, she has led and collaborated on a number of research projects, many of which explore participatory democracy, trust, and collective governance. UKRI is the largest public funder in the UK and has a federated model and some pretty untraditional funding modalities. Karen, how are you harnessing this innovative energy in the service of diversity and inclusion?
Great question. And thank you to everyone for both the invitations to come and to participate with a stellar panel. I guess I'm going to answer this a little obliquely by I think going back to what you started with, which was what the purpose and mission of UKRI. We are a kind of federated model, if you will, in the sense that there are 9 different bodies that have come together to sort of forge and make UK research and innovation. But in that group is also a whole range of direct researchers and innovators and a really kind of complex kind of funding system. And I'm really emphasizing system here, mainly because in many people's mindsets, when they think about research or innovation, they think of a lone singular person doing research, or they think of an innovator creating some sort of innovation, and then we have some product or we have knowledge that's at the end. And UKRI actually acknowledges that what we actually have is a whole massive system where we've got archivists and we've got lab technicians and we've got cleaners, we've got security guards, we've got caterers, we've got a whole set of people from data specialists to others who help make this system work. And we've not done a very good job across in UKRI, in the UK, I think globally, in acknowledging that our system already has a massive, inclusive, wide reach of people who actually play a significant role throughout that whole process. And there's something quite critically important that when we start to think about creating and forging a more inclusive research ecosystem, we actually need to be thinking about what is actually in that ecosystem. That's actually a fundamentally important place to start, is that there's already some amazing things there within that system, and we're not actually recognizing and honoring the wealth of potential. If I though focus, I think quite specifically on the questions that we've been posing around race or other forms of representation. We've got a lot to do. I think Shirley's already made it quite clear about the long-term implications and the kind of aggregation, if you will, and the impacts and effect on those who've been neglected or their work has not been honored or kind of recognized. But we also have to do quite a lot to retain the people who are in our system. We've got an amazing set of researchers and innovators across the globe who we need to do much more work to actually make sure that they realize that research and innovation is a space for them. And we also need to do quite a bit of work to make sure that we invest. And we invest across the piece. We invest in innovative projects and ideas, but we also think about the infrastructure. We also think about what we need to put into the system to essentially allow a variety of individuals to flourish. But I also need to pick up, I think, Daya's point about what we might need to do to reflect on ourselves operationally and as singular entities, but also as a collective. Within UK Research and Innovation, we put out over the summer a fairly powerful statement after the deaths of George Floyd and others also that Shirley had mentioned, mostly in that to not only talk about what that moment meant in a series of other moments, but also more importantly, what this meant for us as an organization, the ways we are going to hold ourselves to account, to the people we invite to the table, to the people we interact with, and the people who are advising us, as well as ultimately listening to our own staff. We hosted a series of different town halls where we wanted to interrogate and question our own thoughts and processes about who we are as individuals, and also our commitment to working on race equality. And that has formulated additional set of work on the back of that. So yes, that's going to go into thinking about our panels and our peer review and our investments, and thinking about the community and the workforce. But this is also starting to shape questions about what is the type of environment we want to create. Who do we want to, how do we want people to move in it? And how do we honor and essentially create a space where racial justice and race equality sits at the core, but also working around and working with all sorts of beautiful difference and thinking about the contributions of a wealth of people. We want to start that revolution, if you will, within ourselves as an organization, but also work hand in hand with others as we start to transform what the landscape looks like. And that's a lot of where we're at right now. This is working collaboratively with other partners, whether or not those are funding bodies or others, where we start to ask these sets of critical questions. And maybe it'll have an operational dynamic to it, but it will also have some fundamental questions, which is, what do we mean by knowledge? Who is a knowledge bearer? And ultimately, how do we create a system that recognizes and rewards the contributions of all? So I'll stop there because I think there'll probably be a whole range of other things that we can continue to reflect on in the panel.
Thanks, Karen. And you're right, there's a lot to unpack in what you've said. I think that your focus on systems, the ecosystem, and thinking, actually, let's not start from a position of deficiency. Let's acknowledge actually what is there, and let's talk about how we're going to invest in that and retain in it. I think that's a very interesting approach. And I will certainly be taking with me that question that you've posed. What's that environment that we want to create, and how do we want to move in it? It's, I think, really quite profound. Kamsal, when we think of giants of science publishing, Elsevier is right up there at the top. In fact, in 2019, Elsevier published nearly 20% of the global research output and accounted for 25% of research citations. You yourself have an interesting background as chair of the Technological Forum at RELEX, the corporate group which Elsevier is part of, and several years working around the world at Bain & Company. Very curious to hear your reflections on what Elsevier is doing and ought to be doing.
Thank you, Nick, and hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to join you all today. Objectives of this panel for me are twofold today. In my experience, positive change requires millions of small movements pulling in the right direction. Silver bullets are rare. And I hope this panel stimulates for each one of us, my esteemed panelists and our audience, to think about what we can do personally to move the needle. Second objective I have is I was a big admirer of the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she said, fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you. And an inclusive world is what I care about and our 8,000 people at Elsevier. And I hope this panel brings others along with us to make progress. I care about an inclusive world because of my own personal experiences. Nick, you referred to it. Diversity has shaped who I am. I was born and raised in Istanbul, in Turkey, educated in the US. I lived in Europe, in South Africa, in Australia. I'm married to a Frenchman. All sorts of beautiful differences, as Karen referred to, I experienced in my experiences. I am the first female CEO of Elsevier, which was founded 140 years ago. And I had a lot of leaders who supported me as I was moving up the ranks, and I hope to be able to do the same for others. Unfortunately, there are many impediments to building a more inclusive research system, so I'll focus on three. First is this is an emotionally raw issue. It's about justice, equal rights, power structures, fairness, history, belonging. Makes us question our own biases, conscious or unconscious. We need many uncomfortable and respectful conversations to change the culture and evolve our mindset. And even when there's positive intent, mistakes can be made in actions and words. I know I get it wrong from time to time. So it's important to have the courage to keep trying and the empathy and compassion to support culture change. Another impediment is that when you focus on one dimension of diversity, be it race or gender, that can be perceived as deprioritizing other dimensions of diversity. And I always start with inclusion, and that leads to diversity. Inclusive cultures are ones where people feel a sense of belonging, regardless of who they are, color of their skin, their gender, their religion, age, sexual orientation, ability. And when it comes to diversity, we must advance it on all fronts because progress for one will lift all, creating a more inclusive mindset. And the third impediment is the structural barriers and systemic bias. We don't always know where the biases lie in the system, but we know they exist, and we need to solve for this. Why is it that Black citizens account for 13% of the US population, but only 6% of Elsevier employees in the same country? Our people policies offer equal opportunities for all. So why doesn't our workforce reflect the makeup of the overall population? Why is that only 7% of university students in science and engineering and less than 5% of microbiology PhDs are Black in the US? We can and we should lift individuals, but unless we identify the systemic issues and fix them, we can't make real progress. We're doing a lot at Elsevier and we need to continue to do more. First and foremost, we're working to ensure a culture and practice of inclusion and diversity within our own company. We have rolled out unconscious bias training and we're investing in increasing psychological safety. Our people are having the difficult conversations. They're sharing their experiences and having courageous conversations. I am enabled, I am proud, I am Black. And we're both mentoring and reverse mentoring our leaders. We have specific talent reviews that focus on women and underrepresented minorities. And we're setting targets and measuring how we're doing with diversity, with psychological safety, with inclusion, and the feedback of our colleagues to identify the systemic issues. Secondly, we're working in partnership to advance inclusion and diversity in the research and healthcare communities that we serve. This includes representation and career development. We're taking deliberate actions to eliminate systemic inequalities around editorial boards of our scientific journals, representation at scientific conferences, peer review, and publishing processes. We're working with early career researchers and embedding policies to ensure gender, sex, and race are factored into the research itself. Through our health business, we're working on improving health outcomes for minority populations, as well as our Elsevier Foundation focuses on that. And as a data and analytics company, we're working on measurement and data-led insights, which are key to both transparency and progress. We made good progress with gender data and are now focusing on race and ethnicity, which is a challenging data gathering exercise. But what you can't measure, you can't progress, so it's important to get the data. And in all of these, we're guided by our independent Inclusion and Diversity Advisory Board of research leaders from across the globe, which I co-chair with Dr. Richard Horton, editor-in-chief of The Lancet. We're also guided by our internal inclusion and diversity employee resource groups and champions around the world. So I'm honored to be here today with Daria, Shirley, and Karen, and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Kamsal. I have to say, it's a very impressive and comprehensive approach that you've outlined. You know, you've talked about some of the individual issues, because actually, you know, when you talk about systems, you also need to recognize that institutional or systemic racism is expressed or experienced individually. And you've also talked about the need to look at structural partnerships, looking at the data and the measurements. I mean, you know, it sounds all really impressive. And I want to kind of take a moment now for us to kind of reflect on some of the challenges that we're facing, right? So for instance, the notion of the ecosystem sounds very cozy. It's kind of like we're all in this together and everybody's going to do their bit and so on. But and I'm going to start, Shirley, with you. Do you see any challenges with the notion of, yes, we're in an ecosystem? I mean, AAAS, I mean, you're big players here. I mean, is this really how you see yourselves? And I'm saying this not just to you, because we recognize that you're a champion, but to the institution, so the people who don't think exactly like you.
I think
I know that you have
that,
some technical issues, so I know that you
yes,
might
I
take
have
a while to
technical
respond. Yeah.
issues. But one of the things that I think is absolutely critical is that it isn't just Shirley as champion, it is a diverse board. It is a CEO who is deeply committed and is willing to be not only open but transparent with regard to being held accountable for the kinds of changes that we all need to make. But I think that the other part of it is basically leadership. We need to engage with other parts of the ecosystem, for example, with the funders, with the other professional groups. That's part of what we're doing within Sea Change, because we aren't just looking at the institutions and trying to provide scaffolding for them to make a difference and to move forward, but also working with our affiliates to have this kind of Sea Change review and transformation from the departments up, trying to affect the changes in the culture and the climate of the disciplines and move them to think differently. Now, does that mean that everybody's on the same page? Probably not, because I think that Suda received some emails that weren't necessarily complimentary and supportive of what he was proposing to do. Our individual members are all over the place. Many of them are supportive. The governance is supportive. Our mission supports this work in terms of who we are, who we've always said we are, and what we want to be. But in terms of bringing every single person, every scientist or engineer or physician within the United States along with this, not yet. And I think that that whole question of what kind of leadership needs to be provided in order to help people begin to understand that science is not going to progress unless we are diverse and inclusive, and that this is an impact not just on people, this is an impact on the institution itself. And so somehow making that case and making it clear to people that we're not going to move forward unless we move forward together and become more open and inclusive, I think that is the challenge that we all are going to have.
I cannot argue with your point about the importance of leadership. It is interesting, however, that you also mentioned that you had some funding to do some of this work. And I want to turn to Daya now. And you know, you have your working group, Daya. You've talked about how you guys have been addressing this in quite a broad and systemic way. I mean, what do you think is going to be the most challenging bit of this change? Is it the leadership? Is it the funding? I mean, yeah, based on the conversations you've been having so far.
Yeah, look, at some stage, and really not too far, not too long from now, funding and the manner in which we are able to resource our actions is going to be important. Money is important in all of these kinds of activities. But really to address the question more directly, so bear in mind that the ISC membership comprises a number of organizations, almost 200, as I'd indicated earlier. And the same applies to many of our partner organizations in this initiative. So the real challenge for us is, it's not a case of a working group, let's say, sitting and beavering away at this and deciding on what to do, but really how we engage with our membership and how we work with our membership in its efforts. And there have to be these efforts in addressing the range of inequalities, the forms of discrimination that we've all been talking about here, both those within the organizations themselves and then also with regard to their practices. And this is going to take concerted work. And we've seen this with other forms of action, of activism, I should say, where certainly it's one thing to build momentum and to develop if you like, a degree of righteous indignation about what is wrong and what needs to happen. But the important thing and the not so easy thing is to follow that all the way through and to ensure that we have actions on the ground. How does the International Mathematical Union, for example, one of our members, go about electing members to its various committees, deciding on its workshops, deciding on its means for funding, early career researchers and the like? I'm sure that a lot of what they do is really good, but we can all benefit from this kind of introspection and reflection. I've got another comment, Nick, that I want to make. Let me just tell you what it's about, and if you prefer, I'll come back to it afterwards. But I've talked about almost exclusively about the scientific community, but I do want to talk about engagement with regard to the general public. I can say a few words about that now, but I'm very happy to pause and come back to it if we have time.
No, why don't you raise the point now?
Okay, all right. It's the same issue, but a different if you like, direction. And it comes back to what I was saying earlier about the role of science and technology as a lever in transformations towards the SDGs. So I talked about the fact that it's global and we have to have cooperation right across the board between scientists, other communities and the like. So here's the thing. Public engagement is an absolutely key aspect of all of this. In other words, we need a general public, civil society, but policymakers as well, who are au fait with how science works, what the issues are, what do we mean by uncertainties, and particularly during this time of the COVID pandemic, there's been a lot of that kind of discussion. But once again, one finds real inequalities in access to that kind of knowledge, in the ability and opportunities to engage and the like. And the extent to which we are not able to mount those barriers and ensure proper inclusivity with regard this time to public engagement would tell in a very direct way on our efforts to advance science and to ensure a more inclusive forms of engagement within the science ecosystem, I should say.
I think that's actually a really important point, actually, Daya. And I see that Karen wants to say something. And just Karen, I'll come to you in a second. And I want to say that it is interesting because when I reflect on the work that we did inside EVNet around gender inclusion, we talked about this from three perspectives: representation, impact analysis, and access. And sometimes I wonder if when we're thinking about diversity and inclusion, we only focus on one of those areas, and in particular on the first in the context of science and innovation. So Karen, I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. I'm actually going to take us back a moment because
Mhm.
I was trying to come in relationship to I think the question you posed to Daya about what are some of the major challenges, and then I'd reflect on the question you've just posed just then.
Mhm.
One challenge that I think ultimately needs to be addressed and thought through very carefully, whether or not we're an institution or you're a funder or you're a university or you're just an interested advocate, is interventions. We've done a lot of work and research on identifying a whole range of different sets of problems. We're not necessarily fully versed on causal mechanisms, but we know quite a lot about problems. But we're really, really patchy when it comes to interventions. What we've got, and within UKRI, we commissioned a series of different evidence reviews. In one of those evidence reviews, we were interested in what was the evidence and the kind of transformation rate or the type of scale of intervention that was happening around equality, diversity, inclusion globally, or D&I globally, and we really wanted to know what was working and what wasn't, and what was out there, and it was actually quite startling how much data people have on their shelf. They've not necessarily published it. How much information is in reports that usually is really, really nicely packaged, but doesn't actually say, please don't ever do this ever because it's awful, and it's not good. We don't see that. We don't talk about it. We don't have a place usually for those sets of interventions. And we don't really effectively talk about scale. We've got a lot of different things that groups have done, but they've done them with small groups. They've done them in small settings or in really engaged work. I mean, it's brilliant. I'm not in any way discounting the absolute sheer importance of this work. But when you start trying to think about doing that with thousands upon thousands of people, with different sets of institutions that function completely differently, with huge different sets of systems, we don't even have a space to start to take into that complexity. So we really need to invest some serious energy in actually starting to understand these interventions, their efficacy, where do they work or don't they? What's the scalar impacts and barriers? And actually start talking about this warts and all, in a much more generative, actually like proper research perspective, so that we can actually move towards a more sustainable policy making space, as opposed to everybody doing ad hoc things, or morally swayed or feeling very deeply compelled, and we're just reinventing the wheel place upon place, with smaller groups of people. So that's my plea around kind of interventions. The point I wanted to raise just in response to something that we've not mentioned within the panel so far that I see as something that will be essential for us for the future. And you've mentioned some of the things that were fundamental to the work for your teams prior, Nick. And I would just add essentially two more. One is equity. We talk a lot about equality, diversity, inclusion, or diversity and inclusion, but we don't talk a lot about equity. What does equity mean, and what would taking an equity lens when we start to think about inclusion or interactions? What would that do to those conversations? How would that transform how we're talking about the interactions upon groups? Because taking in a lens that takes equity as its core would actually go back to the point you raised, Nick, about the ecosystem. It would make it very clear that not everybody in that ecosystem is starting at the same place. They're moving in different places within that system, just like a cell or any other kind of ecosystem. And it's not just equitable parts that are essentially just moving along the same path. They may be coming in and out of that system in different ways, and experiencing completely different sets of historic challenges or interventions, or barriers. And that's really quite central. But I think there's a second one. And for me, this one's really, really fundamental. And we don't talk enough about it, which is repair. We've got a lot of people who've had experiences within our systems. We've had people who've come in, we've had people who've left it. We have people who are adjacent to it, and some who never ever want to even be in it because of whatever experiences they may have had or heard about. But we may need to do quite a lot to repair relationships with people who are in it, and repair our partnerships and our collaborations with the groups that we spend quite a lot of time with. And this reparative work, and I'm not talking about necessarily reparations in a financial sense, I'm actually talking about, rebuilding trust. Sometimes rebuilding connections with different sets of groups. And that's really going to be fundamental. And we need to think about that often as just as vital as the investment part, and just as vital as the inclusion and bringing people to the table is also going to be this question of repair.
Yeah, no, I think this is a really interesting point. And I'm going to ask you a follow-up question. You have 10 seconds. I used to work in radio, so I know what 10 seconds is like. What would the first step in that repair? What would you say would be the first? Because it's an important question to surface, but if we want to go forward, okay, so what do we do about that? Where do we start?
Depending upon what the group is and what our interactions is, I think the first thing is to actually listen. And to spend quite a bit of time seeding power and seeding space so that you can ultimately listen to various different sets of people without telling them what their problem is and without coming in and telling them what you're going to do to them. We need to ultimately start with a listening, and listening openly and listening transparently, and not just listening in a performative way where people tell you a whole bunch of stuff and you do nothing with it.
Okay, thank you. I think it's a really helpful intervention there. Kamsal, I want to come back to this issue of the ecosystem, all right? Because I still feel that it's a helpful concept, but it's also potentially a little bit misleading. As we just heard from Karen, it doesn't acknowledge some of the issues of power. And I remember actually having a conversation with a couple of academics at LSE, London School of Economics, about this, that, when you talk about an ecosystem, one of the issues there is that it feels as if we're all in the same space. And I would like to hear your reflections on this, because Elsevier, it's a business, $3 billion a year type thing. You're not a little player, and not everybody in the ecosystem has the kind of power and leverage that you do. So let's be serious about that. How do we deal with this?
I think the problem with ecosystems, Nick, is whenever you create a system, by definition, there's those that are excluded from that system. So when we use the word system, we need to be very thoughtful about what are we referring to, and is that an open system that actually enables people to be part of it, or is it a closed system? And yes, you are right. At Elsevier, we are a very large publisher. We're a global publisher. We get 2 million submissions from researchers around the globe every year. So we have very, very high reach around globally with researchers. So we're part of a large system of people that can act, and we can drive change. But with systems, you need to be careful that the systems are not exclusive and they are inclusive. And when you look at the research ecosystem, you have institutions, some of which are very, very elite institutions and can be exclusive. You have funders, some of which can be, again, very elite funders and can be exclusive. You have publishing organizations. So that's that is our accountability as leaders of these organizations, to make sure that we ensure the system remains inclusive. So that sounds very conceptual. Let me take it down to an example of what we've been working on, which may sound easy, but it's very difficult. And we've been working on achieving gender balance in our editorial boards. And we have 2,500 journals, and they're all in very, very different disciplines. So when we started this journey, the question was, where do you want to get to? How do you talk to your editors-in-chiefs and your publishers to understand what the outcome you're trying to achieve is? Because in our energy journals, we were at 6% female editors-in-chief. We're at 17% now after 4 or 5 years. And that's a huge achievement, because energy doesn't have a lot of women in it. But in medicine, you should have more than 50, because the field is now more than 50% female. So we actually had to do a lot of work, and we published our gender report. We've done it for 4 years in a row now, that shows globally what is the makeup of every discipline by gender. So you can see the talent pool that you can pull from, which should reflect the editorial board that you have for a journal. And after working on this for 5 years, we're now actually putting targets in place because we know what the discipline gender makeup is. And when I use the word gender, it's actually sex. We still haven't quite cracked the code on all gender classifications. And it took a lot of work to get there, to get the data, to change this big system, and all the 2,500 journals, 8,000 editorial board members we have, and the 2 million authors that submit to us to sort of understand how we can change the system is a huge undertaking. And we're still very much working to progress it. And it's interesting what Karen said about interventions, because in this journey, we learned a lot about interventions, because if you have 2,500 journals, lots of scientists, very innovative people, everybody tried different ways of achieving the goals. I have one editor-in-chief who told me, I have a medical journal, 90% male board, great long-serving editorial board members. What can I do? So I sent them a letter and I said, here's the issue. How are we going to solve this challenge? And 5 of them resigned and actually recommended female colleagues to take their seats. So there's been a lot of ingenuity in the interventions. And then when we find out about these interventions, we share them systemically because we know they work. They don't work in every culture and every discipline. But going back to your question, yes, systems take a long time to change. They can be very exclusive, and you have to work very, very hard to change the nature of that system so it is as inclusive as possible.
I think this is a really interesting story that you've just shared, Kamsal, because one of the things that strikes me is that, at the beginning I said, over the last 20 years, science has made some progress around redressing gender inequalities. And that begs the question, should we be doing more to learn from that? And I'm going to turn to Shirley here, because I have in the past worked with Shirley on some stuff related to gender in STEM, and she has an enormous amount of quite impressive experience in this area. And I'm going to ask you, Shirley, put you on the spot. What are 3 things that we can learn actually from what's been done in gender around other forms of discrimination, particularly around this issue of racial discrimination? Because I think, it's useful to name it. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting about yesterday's session was that we had one of the panelists, Tolu, said, people talk about, oh, we're looking at outcomes around race. And she said, really what you're talking about is racism. She's saying kind of, come on, let's start by naming it, right?
Yes.
But let's talk about what are some of the lessons we can transfer from the work that's been done on gender that we could apply here.
Increasing the numbers is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Because quite frankly, even though we have more women than ever, for example, in the medical fields, we do not have, they have not progressed to the levels of department chairs, of division chiefs, of deans, etc. So necessary, not sufficient. We must be very attentive to issues of women of color, because in too many cases, gender diversity, gender equality has meant white women equality, not women of color. And I think that the peculiar intersection and the intersectionality issues have really not been addressed. And the third thing is that I'm not really sure that the rules that apply to gender apply to race. Because the men who are in charge essentially may have wives, sisters, mothers who look like them, but race is different. Race has carried with it for a very long time this issue of deficiency. And therefore, it has the leakage from society about the place of race and racism within the larger society has not, in fact, it hasn't really changed the conversation. We've changed the conversation about women. We have not changed the conversation about race.
Okay, that's really interesting. We have a question that is from the audience here about, again, it's related to this challenge around the ecosystem, and they talk about the funding coming from the global north, which influences the research agenda. And Komsal, I am assuming, but it would be useful to hear what you say, that in fact it would take a similar kind of approach around the documentation, concerted documentation, to surface this and then to be able to set targets, perhaps about research agendas and where they come from, how they're managed. What are your reflections?
So I absolutely agree with that, and I think I agree with Shirley. There has been progress made in gender, and if I can say so without being offensive, I think gender is easier than race. We have to do a lot more harder work to actually achieve our objectives around race. And if you look at, for example, in our editorial boards, we can look at nationality. So that enables us to be able to make sure there's global South representation and global North representation. We can look at the time from the first paper that was published as a proxy of experience to make sure early career researchers can publish as well as experienced researchers. We can look at gender, but we don't have the data for race. And that's what we're working on right now with a working group. And race is a lot harder because there's a lot of different legal and compliance hurdles, especially journals. I'll speak for Elsevier are global. So we have authors that come from everywhere in the globe. And it's very tricky to navigate your way through the legal and compliance issues. So what we're working on is actually we're trying to see if we can voluntarily get the data, but that means we have to make sure everybody feels very, very comfortable because this is a very personal choice. And that's what we're working through now, because I do think the data helps. I think it shows the discrepancies. I've seen the funding data for women researchers. They tend to have smaller grants and they tend to get less. I haven't seen that by race. I'm sure the data exists someplace, but the data matters. It really helps actually people understand the issue and focus on how you can move the needle. And I go back to what you can't measure, you can't progress. So it's really important to have the right measurements in place and look at whether we're progressing things. And that's where how we can tell whether interventions are working or not. Otherwise, we're going blind.
Yeah, no, and I can see actually this opens up a lot of potential around this issue of research agendas, what knowledge is valued, and so on, if we're really concerted about it. Daya, I have two tricky questions for you. One of them is inspired, everybody's smiling because they're like, yeah, it's Daya, not me. The first one actually is inspired by a question from the audience, where they say, do panelists believe that nowadays spirituality is also an attribute around which you can be discriminated against? And I would like to hear your thoughts on that. But I want to couple this with a bigger question, which is, you said that you started your working group focused around the response to George Floyd's death and racial discrimination, but you decided to extend that. What are the pros and cons of this, and why did you decide to extend it, actually, in view of these pros and cons? And by extension, would it include, I guess, this issue around spirituality? I have another question for you about a decision that you've made, and something that you said earlier, but I'll let you start with that, with a response to that.
All right, sure. Well, look, with regard to your first question, Nick, in a sense, the answer is a very simple one. Yes, if one were to ask the broader question, what are the forms of discrimination that are evident? They really are. They cover a broad range of phenomena, categories, aspects of communities, and the like, and certainly that would be the case. With regard to that, in a way, this is a slightly oblique comment, but just going back to what I was saying earlier about public engagement, one of the areas where scientists and science communicators have made huge mistakes in engaging with the public around controversial issues, like let's say genetic modification, for example, is it's not so much about discrimination, but not respecting the fact that people come from particular cultures, backgrounds, and the like, and to be aware of one's objective. What is my objective? My objective is to persuade somebody of the scientific foundations of whatever it is that I'm presenting. Now, that's the first part, the first question. The second is why we extended or agreed to expand the scope of our work. Well, we had exactly this this conversation in the working group, and there were some members who felt that, you know, racial discrimination is so pervasive and it is so deep-seated, and its consequences are felt to such an extreme degree that it is, in a way, a special kind of discrimination which should have our focus. The alternative view was that, yes, indeed, we must do this, but in a sense, you know, it's folly to compartmentalize the different forms of discrimination and bias, that all forms of bias, discrimination, often conscious, sometimes unconscious. And if one is talking about, for example, institutional culture, how do you build an inclusive institutional culture? It does not help to compartmentalize the problems if that is one's goal.
Okay, thank you. That's a very useful reflection on the issue. We are pretty much out of time now, and I'm just going to ask each of you, basically give you 30 seconds to reflect on anything, A, that you want to say, but you haven't had time to say just yet, or to, if there is something that you heard from one of your fellow panelists that you feel is really worth validating, emphasizing, now is the time to do that. And I'm going to start from the left side of the panel, certainly on the screen as I'm looking at it here, which is with Kumsal, and we'll go around and Karen, and then it will be Daya, Shirley, and then Karen. So Kumsal, any final thoughts, anything you haven't had a chance to say, or is there something you heard and you thought that that's really worth revisiting, that's really worth taking away?
I heard a lot that I think is worth taking away and revisiting. So I will just summarize it by saying I think this is a really important moment in time. I think George Floyd's murder and everything, all the passion and emotion that has come out of that around the globe to right systemic injustices and to defeat systemic racism is something we all now need to take and build on that momentum and drive real change. And I genuinely am very hopeful and encouraged that we're going to be able to do that, because I see there's incredible passion, energy, and innovation that everybody is putting at the grassroots level. And I think as leaders of different organizations, our job is to make sure we have the right focus, the resources, and continue to make progress.
Thank you, Kumsal. Daya.
Yes, I've learned a lot from this panel discussion. Bottom line is, what do we do to ensure greater inclusivity, social inclusion, a sense of belonging? And here I would be referring to the scientific community, but more broadly as well. We have a lot of hard work ahead of us in our partner organizations, the work that we are doing, and more broadly. A lot of that work must have to do with understanding the issues. And Kumsal or somebody had talked earlier about listening. That is so important, listening and understanding what the issues are about. Many of these are, if you like, cultural in nature, but many can and should be measured. We should set targets, as again had been mentioned, and measure our progress. And then my final point is that this is, in a way, not like the SDGs where we have 2030 or whatever date as a target goal. This is something that has to be a continuous process, something that we work on all the time.
Shirley.
We must change the institutions that define what merit is and that perpetuate culture. I think that that's one of the reasons we decided to start with colleges and universities, because if we do not, we are continuously sending the same messages into the next generation. I do want to say that I totally agree with Karen's focus on equity, because all of us are not starting from the same place, and yet we are being asked to live by the same measures.
Thank you. Karen.
I won't belabor because I know we're running out of time. So because I could plus one almost everything everyone has said and really value it. I guess the one thing I'd want to leave the audience and maybe with my panelists with thinking about is how do we do this work transparently? How do we do the really hard, difficult work and really delve into this and do it as openly and as transparently as possible? And I just want to note that in certain environments and places, this is actually quite hard because of whatever might be the political environment or the infrastructures that our various institutions are in, that they can't be necessarily as open as they might want to be. And in other instances, they should be more transparent than they are. So I think there's a real key question for us about how do we give each other the space, the safety, and the challenge to do this work as openly as we can.
Thank you, Karen. I think this is all very, very impressive points that you've made. A lot of food for thought. We've meant to build on the conversation that started actually on the systemic racism in science. And in fact, it's really interesting that we've addressed a lot of the issues that they've raised. I was really pleased that I was very pleased that Daya mentioned this issue about kind of transformation being an ongoing process. You know, this is the thing about change management. You know, it's not a meeting. It's something that we have to kind of be quite vigilant about. One thing that did come up actually during our panel, which they didn't hear so much of yesterday, was this issue around the, as it were, the instrumental value of diversity and inclusion. Daya's talked about this on more than one occasion over the last hour, the point that actually it serves the SDGs, it serves the uptake and the resonance of scientific practice and innovation. Of course, this opens up another question around kind of this versus a social justice argument, you know, that everybody should be included just by virtue of whether or not it makes a difference. They really ought to be included. But that's a conversation perhaps for another time. I'd like to start by thanking our esteemed panelists for sharing their time, their knowledge and their wisdom. I would like to thank Elsevier, who have been instrumental in convening this session, particularly Yolan and Max, who've done so much work behind the scenes. Of course, the team at Fallen Walls, and you, our audience, for joining us. There's going to be a recording of the session available, so feel free to share far and wide with allies and enemies. And we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.